Hi everyone, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning in to watch one of our talks today. We are a year-round digital talk series bringing you the best creative voices across film, television, and theater, both in front and behind the camera. And today is absolutely no exception. We are joined by the wonderful Brent White, who's an incredible editor who has really just made all of the comedies that you love watching over several years, you know, from Anchorman and 40-Year-Old Virgin to Knocked Up, Step Brothers, Ghostbusters, you know, and even earlier bouts on films like Matilda. And I'm so grateful that you've taken time out of your day to talk to us about everything to do with editing and post-production, because I feel like it's not often something that we get to have as many Q&As around and really dive into. And specifically with comedy, you've done so much incredible work in that realm. And I was really interested in kind of like what the specific nuances are, because, you know, on any film, I think an editor's making multiple versions of the film, and there's always kind of lots of different steps along the way. But particularly with comedy, because you've worked in so many spaces with such heavy improv performances, I was really interested in what the specifics of that realm are and how many more versions there almost end up being, because I imagine that if you have two different versions of a joke, that this part over here doesn't fit with this part, but would with that part. So there's so many different choose your own adventures that you could go on.
That's really kind of the way that it works a little bit with the improv stuff, is that you look at the scene and you kind of see what it's supposed to do in the movie, and then whatever they capture on the day, then you try to make the very best of what happened in front of the camera. And that's really one of the really most beautiful things about the job, is that, you know, every day you go, well, what am I going to get today? And I kind of know what the scene's supposed to do, and I know what the intention is, and then just insanity ensues. And it's a pleasure for me to put it together, because sometimes it's just like, oh, well, if this joke joins to this joke, joins to this joke, and then you just got to make a path through it, and then once it's all in one piece, then it's really just about molding it and shaping it and making it so that it's tight and moves and has the, you know, pauses and the places that you need to like lay back just a little bit, or how do you make each joke perform the best way that it possibly can, and that becomes it becomes this sort of Darwinism of a comedy. It's like, oh, only the really strong are going to survive, and the weak and you know, whatever, the titters or whatever it is, that, you know, those don't make it. So and that's also one of the joys of having that amount of material, is that you can really, you know, if something doesn't work, you've got options, you got places to go, and things to try, to see if you can make it work any better.
Yeah. And even just from a technical standpoint, for managing that volume of footage and all the different takes, I know that you've always kind of worked with a digital script that will be transcribed from the footage on set. But I was really interested that you know, the last couple of films that you've done with Paul Feig and Judd Apatow specifically, that there's been a stenographer on set. And I was really curious about how that came about and how that's really added to your process.
It was this moment when we were working on one of Judd's movies, is that there was so much stuff that was happening on the day. And then once we got back to the cutting room, to be able to figure out where that moment was, because the directors, they have remarkable memory of like, oh, I remember when we did this. And because of the amount of material that you're going through, sometimes you go, I don't know, I can't, I don't remember seeing that, you know, and so there are these moments where you kind of like, you have to dive back into the material to see where it is. And what happened with Judd is that he would go through the stenographer's notes and he would highlight, he says, here's the line I like, here's the joke I like, and here's this. And then that would help me get back to the actual footage to see if it was a viable coverage for that line. And so it was really, really super helpful in that regard, that it was sometimes just a helpful roadmap to figure out what it is that he had in his head, so that I could get it on the screen.
Yeah, and the great thing is obviously working with Judd and Paul and Adam McKay and a lot of your longtime collaborators is, at this point, I imagine that you have a certain sense of what they like, what they're likely to respond to, what kind of they're going to want to pull into the edit, which would help the process. But especially when you were first starting out with them as collaborators, what are the most useful tools that a director can give you in terms of explaining their vision and just giving you that sense early on, so that when you're putting the rough cut together initially, sometimes while they're still on set and they're not yet in the room with you, that you can kind of put together the best version that they're going to respond to?
I think it's just a matter of dialogue, just talking about what happened on the day, and kind of like just seeing what can be, seeing what the intent is, and that's really the most information that I can get from what happens on the set when I'm not there, is that what's the intention, because sometimes you get a little far afield of what is actually on the printed page, and so it really helps to understand what it is that happened that you really like focused in on or connected with, and that was some of the information that I would get from, when I was putting something together. Sometimes that's in the script notes from the script supervisor, but oftentimes it's just a matter of like, I do this thing where if they're working in the evening, I'll go in and work my day, my 9 to 9 or 8 or whatever it is. And if they're working into the night, then after work I'll go by the set and just kind of hang out and just chat, and we'll talk about what happened that day. We'll talk about what happened 3 or 4 days ago, and it's just a matter of just kind of having that kind of information. Plus, being on the set, oftentimes, the costume person will sidle up next to you and say, "Oh, don't forget about this, and look at this," and you get a lot of information just secondhand sometimes. And the DP will say, "Oh man, we had a terrible time getting this one shot," and then the lights, well, I hate it. And so that, oh, that's a problem situation, it's a problem place, and maybe we can avoid it, in the first cut or whatever it is. But that's kind of the beauty of what I get to do, is that first pass is kind of like, oh, how I make it to please me. I make it so that I enjoy it and think it's funny, but I also will cut stuff together and says, oh, I think Paul's really gonna like that, or Judd's really gonna think that's funny, and I think that's really a place to start from. How can I entertain the guys that I work with? How can I make them really love what they've done? Because sometimes there's this PTSD situation that just happens, just because of the rigors of being on set and all the personalities and the producers and the studio and there is this like, and so I want them to remember what the original intention was, what drew them to the material, to the script, to the actors, and try to emphasize and put those things to the fore so that they can really enjoy what they've accomplished.
Yeah, and I love that being on set at the end of the day is part of your process. And even beyond that, I know that sometimes you'll go down for a specific scene. Like if you take the massive Times Square scene for Ghostbusters, I know that was one that you were on set for. So what's that decision process in looking at what are the scenes, obviously something like that where there's just so many actors and there's so many different trajectories going on, where it's going to be a really valuable asset to you to be on set for that particular role.
That's really interesting. A lot of times what happens when you do a lot of stunt work and stuff like that is that there is this ability to actually, if I'm there on the set, I'm actually cutting it in my head as they're putting it together. I'm literally going, oh, this piece goes here and this piece goes there. And then, I really liked how that turned out. And it's just a reference. So once I get back into the room and in front of my machine, then I go, oh yeah, that the way that, that person slid across the screen, or the way they brought the guns up, or whatever it is, or the car did a certain thing, or came around a corner that caught this architecture that was really amazing in the background, or just the way that the light hit something, and those are things that I try to like, oh, how can I shoehorn that into the movie and get those little time pieces, and plus what happened on Ghostbusters is that Paul was in another part of this, another part of the set shooting something else. And I was on the green screen set with the second unit director and the stunt guys, working with them and shooting all the stunt guys and seeing all that kind of stuff. And then Paul would come in and with the principal actors, and we would shoot with the principal guys. And so I already had a sense of what the stunt people were doing and what I could use and what I couldn't use because of their faces and replacements and all that kind of thing. But how I could get the principals to slide into that stuff and make it work as seamlessly as possible. And so that's the other thing, like when on Spy, we had this big helicopter thing at the end of the movie. And so there were like there's 4 different elements. There's like real helicopters with stunt performers, real helicopters with principal actors, flying around the lake with stunt helicopters and stunt performers and da-da-da. And then there was a day of green screen with a fake helicopter and principal actors. And so how do you make all of those elements that were shot over a period of a week, all come together? And just being around on the day going, oh, I kind of want this shot for this, or, and that's the reason we're spending all this time to do this, because I want to see this kind of action. And I want to see Jason Statham hanging from Melissa McCarthy's legs. And so, how do I make that as, have the upshot and from above and from the side, and then I have the big wide shot where there's a guy hanging on a stunt person's legs, out across the lake and stuff like that. And that's it. And that really becomes that's actually a lot of fun. I mean, comedy's so much fun to put together and to make people laugh and stuff, but I'm a guy and I like cars and guns and whatever, and the action stuff is just so much fun. That's Talladega was just a treat, because whenever I was tired of cutting stuff funny, I could say, well, I'm just gonna play with the race cars for a little bit and see how I can make that better, and that's really one of the joys of those type of movies.
Yeah, and it's so funny because everybody knows you for comedy editing, but at the same time, you've edited so many action sequences and so much stunt work, especially over the last few years. And, I know someone like Paul Feig especially really likes to do a lot of practical effects. And so, if you take something like Ghostbusters, even having someone in a green screen suit, like playing the ghost so that there's something for the actors to respond to. But I imagine that that's a huge value and an asset for you as well, and was curious about how that helps you in your process, particularly when you're putting together those first rough cuts before it goes off to the VFX team.
Because it really helps. It helps you place where the ghost or whatever it is going to be, and it just helps, or the stunt performer or whatever it is. It helps you place them in the world, and it just creates it creates a pattern that it becomes believable. And then basically, because Paul does all that stuff practically, when we send it away to the visual effects guys, they're just augmenting, putting stuff on top of stuff that we already have. And that becomes the real joy of the visual effects, is that they can tweak it and make it funnier and better and that kind of thing. And sometimes you can't even tell what it's going to look like until after you see the visual effects. And one of the hazards is that because sometimes it takes so long to get the visual effect in, as I'm working on the movie, I keep tightening it and shortening it. It's just, oh, well, that looks terrible because there's all that green screen and there's that fake thing right there in the middle of the frame. And so I continue to like compress it and shorten it and make it really tight. And then when the visual effects finally come in, because you've ordered them 3 months ago, they come in and they're longer, and so there's stuff at the end. And so at the end, once I get the visual effects, I go, oh, I should really open that up. There's something happening at the end of that little shot that's really kind of cool, and I should just open that up. And so it becomes a problem, because I'm at the end of the day and we're on the mix stage and we're doing all these other things. I'm going, well, if I had another 8 frames, that would be really cool. And so I don't make very many friends, because I'm always kind of like undoing the lock and opening things up to make it a little bit better and stuff like that. And that's just, I think that's just the dance that you do with visual effects, because you have to lock everything down so soon. And then once you get the material back, then it becomes another performance, another idea that you can now integrate into the show for better or worse. If it's not very good, you can continue to compress and tighten. But if it is really magical and wonderful, then you can just go, whoa, let's do that. Let's just open it up. And that's part of the dance.
Yeah. And I was really interested in terms of what the collaborative process looks like with you working with, you know, the music supervisor, the composer, and the sound design team, because there's such an art to it, you know, even down to the selection of music, which is, you know, obviously a collaborative choice. But even just like the levels and the way that it's going to come in, because you are so great at using music and using sound as like that added tool for comedy, whether it's a piece of music seeping in as someone's telling a joke, or whether it is kind of how you're going to utilize the sound from those effects that you were talking about.
Yeah, you know, it all comes back to, for me, in a really weird way, is that in college, I put myself through college as a disc jockey, and I would work from midnight to 6 in the middle of the night. And so I would make ads and do stuff. And so I did all this stuff so I have this real love and sense of music and stuff like this that I just can't, that I just really, really enjoy. And it is part of my process. I'm one of those guys that actually cuts with music on in the room. Like when I'm just working on stuff, there's something going on in the room, and it I think subconsciously or in the background or whatever, it adds a certain rhythm or stuff to the things that I do, depending on what I'm listening to. And so it's just kind of it's an interesting aspect of looking at that. And we have these great music people that we've worked with over the years that have just been super helpful. And I can go to, for example, Erica Weiss, who's worked on several of our movies. I'll go to Erica and say, okay, this is what I want. This is the song we want. And I don't know how long it's going to be. The song's 3.5 minutes long, but I need 1:30, maybe 1:10, and maybe 50 seconds. Can you cut me a version of that song that are those sizes? And that way, instead of making the cut and then trying to shoehorn the music onto it, I'm actually cutting to something specific so that I know, you know, exactly what it's going to be. And so if it has to be 50 seconds, I already have like this organic version of the song or the music that is that size, and then I can kind of compress into that box. And so it's really helpful to have people around, because I'm not a great music editor and I'm a terrible music editor. And so I always have somebody have to check my work and make sure that I haven't mucked it up so it can't be fixed, because it happens. There is a terrible music edit in one of the episodes that I did of Freaks and Geeks, and every time I see it, it's a dagger in my heart. It just kills me. And so it's just part of the aspect that I really enjoy because of my background and stuff like that. So, and the other thing is that Teddy Shapiro, who's been a composer of ours for several years now, will send us music up front. Like, you know, he'll read the script and he'll say, this is kind of what I'm thinking, this is the idea. And Teddy and Paul will have conversations about stuff, but I'll get preliminary sketches and stuff like that I can throw up against the movie. And it adds such a wonderful element. Like in Simple Favor, there's this wonderful, we use all this French pop music, and it was so fun to dive into that kind of like kitschy kind of, but really fun kind of stuff. But then Teddy brings in this, like, you know, this kind of Hitchcockian kind of stuff, but light in a really wonderful way. And to have that as a color palette early on really helps figure out what the movie is. Because the thing is that you leave an editor to his own devices and you're going to get, you know, the Grateful Dead and AC/DC and all the things that I love, or whatever it is. And that may not be right for the movie, but you're going to get to the places where I feel comfortable. And the other aspect about the movie is that they bring music to the movie that I go, wow, I've never ever heard that guy before. I really like that. I really, really, you know. And so it opens up my world too in ways that I never imagined. I go, well, that's a really cool band. I'm gonna buy all their stuff, see them live, and that's the way that's the way I live.
That's how your CD collection grew.
It's nuts. It's just, it's been going on forever. And it is a it's, you know, it's an addiction. It's just simply that. Music as an addiction. So there are worse things.
Yeah. I was also really interested in talking a little bit about the collaborative relationship between actors and editors, because I don't think that people always kind of necessarily see that as an obvious collaborative relationship, but, you know, especially in terms of a lot of the films that you've worked on, you know, I imagine that at this point, when you're editing Will Ferrell footage, that like, you know exactly what it looks like when it's a seamless flow between improv, or when there's like a tiny flicker in his eye where he's thinking about the next idea before he delivers it, and the value in being able to catch those moments and pull it out and really understand the rhythms and the beats of a performer. So is there a point where you're kind of touching base with them at any point during production process, or is it really just from editing together the footage that you get to know their rhythms and beats and how they approach their performance?
I think it is just by looking at the material that you really see them, because basically you spend all day long looking at them really up close and you know, in close up and right shot, you see the way they move and stuff like that. And it becomes slightly weird when you go to the set and meet them in person, because you spent all this time with them. You feel like you kind of know them in a way, and they don't know you from Adam. And so it's like, but over time, I think that, especially with Will, as an example, that I understand that Will is a really specific, wonderful comic tool. And Adam knows how to bring what Will does best out to the fore. And he's just, and so in seeing what Adam wants and then knowing how, you know, the way that Will works, it becomes really fun to actually mold Will's performances, knowing that he can go to here and then he can go to here and just find out what the funniest and I think it really thrills them when they see that all that effort that they do on set isn't just wasted, just doesn't go away. I really try to, you know, hammer out a way for them to see all the really beautiful things that they've done. That's why the early cuts are so freaking long, is that there's all that material that I'm trying to, this is really good, and this is really good, and this is really good. And then at the end of the day, it's about taking all that material and then fitting it into that 2-hour box, so that it becomes the movie that it is. And what's interesting with some of Adam's things is that over the years, especially the Anchorman movies, we've done these couple of interesting experiments. On the first Anchorman, there was a second movie that we made out of the outtakes. Basically, there was a whole B section of the story that was lifted from the movie because it didn't test very well in previews. And so I had all this really wonderful comedy stuff, this whole other story arc. And so instead of just putting together, you know, 30, 40 minutes of deleted scenes, I said, well, why don't I take that little story arc and just make it another little Ron Burgundy adventure? And even though it's not as good and it's not the movie or the feature that we all love and adore, there's this other element to it that's really quite funny. And so it has there's a thread through it. And so we made a little movie called Wake Up Ron Burgundy, which is just really this B story, and of a lot of the other things in the movie that I couldn't fit into the actual feature. And there's a lot of really funny stuff in there. And so it didn't go to waste. And then the other thing that happened on the second Anchorman movie is that we had all these alternate jokes. So we did a version of the movie where we would flip out the joke. So the movie is exactly the same. But then in the second movie, instead of the A joke, I went to the B joke and just went through the whole movie. And then we're like, well, somebody did a count and somebody said there was like 400 new jokes in the second version. So, which is, it's a completely different animal, but all those wonderful things that they did on the day were really, really fun and really fun to put together. So that also becomes part of the process is, I think for us, is testing and previewing things in front of an audience will actually help us figure out what it's going to do, because they're really the final arbiters about what's funny and what's not funny. You can really tell in a room, oh, well, those 400 people didn't get that joke. That's a problem. So it's a matter of fixing, you know, what that can be, and that also helps us dial in the comedy and make it this kind of like roller coaster thing that builds in a way that gets funnier, and then boom, that's when you're doing it right. Is like when you can like pull an audience along with you, and then all of a sudden just make them really just explode, either laugh or cringe or that's magic. Sitting in a preview theater with 400 people and just manipulating them like that, I know it's evil, but it's really, really fun.
I love something that you've mentioned in the past in terms of how you almost enjoy when you create something where people miss some of the jokes, because it's a sign of there being so much content and so many hits. Like even when you were talking about that test screening where you added 400 jokes to one version of it, it's a huge amount of volume that is definitely not all going to land the first time. And so I was interested in the way that when you're editing, you don't just think about the first experience of someone watching a movie, that you really think, what is this going to feel like for this person when they watch it for the 5th time, the 10th time, when they watch it, revisit it for the first time 2 years from now.
Yeah, by themselves in the middle of the night. Like, oh, how is that going to play? I mean, and that's also one of the things is that, people go, oh, well, you got to build in this space for a laughter because the audience is going to laugh here. And they're going to miss the next joke. And I said, I don't care. Just push. Make them catch up. And they'll thank you for it because they'll be more, I'm dragging them along in a way that's really, really lovely. Yeah.
And then I wanted to ask you about, obviously one of the most commonplace phrases that we hear on film sets and we hear in the film industry is, oh, we'll fix it in post, which I'm sure as an editor is the bane of your existence. And so I just wanted to ask you about what are the most frustrating things that filmmakers sometimes think that they can fix in post that actually they really need to make sure that they work in production?
Oh boy. I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, but but there are times when people will be like put out by, oh, let's say a haircut or a wig or something like that, and they'll like just focus on that one thing and they won't see any of the other stuff. And for me, I'm not even looking at that. I'm like the worst. Like they go, don't you hate that wig? And I go, what's wrong with that wig? That person's really funny. So I have this, so there are things that I don't focus on in a way that some people really like focus on. And so when they say we're going to fix it in post, sometimes I'm fixing things that are peripheral. If I can get the language to work and the script to work and the jokes to land, then all that other stuff is maybe going to go away because you're going to be like connected and enjoying or emotional or whatever it is. If I can get you to be connected to the piece and the show in that way, then all that other stuff kind of goes away. There's this thing that somebody once told me. He says that people watch, when you talk to somebody, you look at their eyes. And so there are times where I'll make a cut or a version of a thing where I know that I'm going to make it. I'm going to cut the dialogue or do this thing. But if you're watching this part of it, then you're not going to see any of whatever this is. And it was there's a real interesting thought process behind this. I was in London last year on a picture, and I went to this talk. This guy, this magician that did like a real theoretical talk about where your eye goes in a thing. And he did this bit where he put glasses on a person, and the glasses had cameras out the front. And then he put the camera, what the guy was seeing, up on a screen behind him. And then he would do a magic trick in front of him. And you would see where his eye goes. And you would see that he's not looking where the magic stuff is happening over here. And so it was really kind of an education to me, is that, oh, I can lead people to look at this, and whether it's with a splash of color or with this or the way that it's cut, because I don't want them to see this thing over here that I'm mucking around with, because it doesn't quite match what's happening in the next shot. So it was really fascinating to me to see that kind of like real intellectual thought process that goes into what I want you to do is I just want to, I'm going to move your eye around the screen. And you do that by shot selection and where how big the head is and how much of the torso is and where the eyes are, and a move or a big move with an arm or whatever can actually bridge a cut that will save you, a lot of time and can actually collapse things so that it just feels tighter and brighter and moving forward in a great way.
That is an interpretation of movie magic I never saw coming.
Because there is a thing when you watch a movie, someone is directing your eyes, and the best directors, you go, that's a beautiful shot. And then, where does he want me to look? And so it is part of the editing process. It's like moving the audience through an environment, to get them to feel the best jokes and the right action and that kind of thing. And it's just, I don't know, it's just a little thing I picked up that I thought was really fascinating. There's a lot you can do.
Hugely, hugely fascinating. And thank you so much for taking time out of your day to talk to us about all of this. It's been such a pleasure.
No problem.